I started noticing the domes because they were everywhere. Every courthouse in every county seat, every train station in every major city, every government building from Boston to St. Petersburg. They rose above the rooflines in copper and bronze, oxidized green or polished gold, always positioned at the highest point of the structure, always connected to something below. Architecture historians call them decorative. I call them functional. After 3 years of research across 12 countries and 47 archives, I believe these domes were energy collectors, not symbolic, not ornamental. Actual working components in a continental power distribution system that operated for decades before someone decided to shut it down and pretend it never existed. The breakthrough came in Budapest. I was examining construction records for the Hungarian Parliament building, completed in 1904, when I found a discrepancy in the copper tonnage. The official architectural plans specified 40 tons of copper for the central dome's exterior cladding. The procurement records showed 87 tons. Where did the other 47 tons go? The difference was too large to be waste or error. I started comparing similar buildings across Europe. The pattern repeated: Vienna's Hofburg Palace, Prague's National Museum, Berlin's Reichstag before the 1933 fire. Every structure showed the same discrepancy. Architectural plans listed exterior copper. Procurement records showed double or triple the specified amount. The extra copper wasn't decorative. It was hidden inside the buildings themselves, integrated into structural systems that the public architectural drawings never documented. I filed Freedom of Information requests in 9 countries. I examined every accessible blueprint, every renovation record, every maintenance report filed for 19th century civic buildings with copper domes. What I found was a secondary structural system, present in building after building, documented in procurement and construction records, but absent from the final architectural drawings released to the public. This secondary system consisted of vertical copper channels running from the dome down through the building's interior walls, connecting to what the construction notes described as foundation grounding plates. In several buildings, these grounding plates extended 20 to 30 feet below the lowest basement level, far deeper than any structural or waterproofing requirement would explain. The channels and plates were installed before the interior finishing work, then sealed behind plaster and stonework, invisible to anyone who later occupied the buildings. The copper wasn't wiring. The buildings predated electrical wiring as we understand it. Edison's first commercial power station didn't open until 1882. The Hungarian Parliament's construction began in 1885. Most of the domed civic buildings across Europe and North America were designed in the 1850s through 1870s, decades before anyone could have been planning for electric lighting. Yet they all contained these hidden copper systems, precisely engineered, consistently implemented, serving a purpose that the official architectural record never explained. I believe they were energy collectors, specifically atmospheric energy collectors, designed to capture and distribute electrical charge from the Earth's natural electromagnetic field. The domes were the collection points, the vertical channels were the conductors, the foundation plates were the grounding connections, and the buildings themselves were nodes in a network. The idea sounds impossible only if you assume that electrical distribution requires wired connections. It doesn't. Nikola Tesla proved that atmospheric transmission was possible in the 1890s. His Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island was designed to transmit electrical power through the Earth's electromagnetic field without any physical connection between generator and receiver. The tower was demolished in 1917 before it became fully operational. But Tesla's notes, the portions that were released after his death, make clear that he wasn't inventing the principle. He was reconstructing it. He referenced historical precedent. He described atmospheric conduction as a demonstrated technology. He wrote about prior implementations without specifying who had implemented them or when. I believe he was trying to rebuild something that Tartaria had already built and that the 19th century had inherited without understanding its origin. The buildings themselves are the evidence. I've mapped the distribution of domed civic structures across Europe and North America from 1850 to 1900. The spacing is not random. Major buildings with prominent copper domes appear at intervals of 40 to 60 miles. Smaller buildings with lesser domes or copper-clad towers appear at intervals of 8 to 15 miles between them. This is network spacing. This is the distribution pattern of transmission and relay nodes in a power grid. The pattern holds across regions that had no coordinated urban planning, designed by architects who had no documented contact with each other, funded by governments with entirely different political structures. You don't independently arrive at identical network spacing unless you're building to a pre-existing plan. The The plan, I believe, was not drawn by 19th century architects. It was inherited. The buildings went up around infrastructure that was already in the ground. Every major World's Fair from 1851 to 1915 was built on one of these network nodes. The Crystal Palace in London, 1851. The Palais de l'Industrie in Paris, 1855. The Machinery Hall in Philadelphia, 1876. The White City in Chicago, 1893. The Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, 1901. The Louisiana Purchase Exposition in St. Louis, 1904. Every fair documented extraordinary electrical illumination, far exceeding what contemporary generator technology could have reasonably produced. The 1893 Chicago Fair lit 250,000 incandescent bulbs across 600 acres. The published generator capacity could have powered perhaps 80,000 bulbs under optimal conditions. Where did the rest of the power come from? The official records credit improved dynamo efficiency. I believe the fairs were tapping into the atmospheric network. The extraordinary illumination wasn't produced by the generators, it was produced by the existing network that the fair sites were built over. The generators provided supplemental power and visible evidence of conventional electrical technology. The real power source was invisible, undocumented, and built into the landscape. I spent 4 months in Chicago examining records related to the 1893 fair. The site preparation documents are revealing. Before any pavilions were constructed, crews excavated and installed what the records describe as foundation infrastructure for the main exhibition halls. These excavations extended far deeper than the building foundations. In several locations, construction notes reference the discovery of pre-existing stone structures below the water table. These structures were not removed. They were cleaned, reinforced, and integrated into the new fair buildings. The notes describe them as remnants of earlier construction. They don't specify what earlier construction. Chicago was incorporated as a city in 1830. Before that, it was wetland and prairie. What structures could have predated the city by enough time to be discovered, buried below the water table? The notes don't answer that question. They record what was found and what was done with it, cleaned, reinforced, connected to the new buildings. And then, at night, the fair lit up with power that no documented source fully explains. The pattern repeats at every major fair. Deep excavations, discovery of pre-existing structures, integration of those structures into the new buildings, extraordinary electrical illumination beyond the capacity of the documented generators. And then, after the fair ended, the demolition. The pavilions came down, the generators were removed, but the foundation infrastructure remained. It's still there, under Grant Park in Chicago, under Forest Park in St. Louis, under Delaware Park in Buffalo. I've examined city utility maps for all 3 locations. The maps show underground structures in those areas that are classified as historical foundations or filled construction remnants. Nobody has excavated them. Nobody has asked what they were foundations for. They're marked on the maps as remnants of the world's fairs, and that explanation has been sufficient to prevent anyone from examining them more closely. I believe those foundation structures are part of the atmospheric network. I believe the world's fairs were not demonstrations of new technology. They were demonstrations of old technology, temporarily reactivated to show what the system could do when operating at full capacity. And I believe the fairs served another purpose. They allowed technicians to access the network nodes under the cover of legitimate construction and electrical work. Whatever modifications or measurements were done to those nodes during the fair preparations, those activities were buried in thousands of pages of construction and operational records that no one has ever analyzed as a coherent data set. I've spent 3 years trying. The records are fragmentary, scattered across multiple archives, written in 3 languages, often misfiled or incompletely catalogued. But the pattern is there: access to the nodes, extraordinary power output, demolition, and sealing. Every fair followed the same sequence, and by 1915, the fairs stopped happening. The Panama Pacific International Exposition in San Francisco was the last of the great illuminated fairs. After that, no more world's fairs with unexplainable electrical capacity, no more excavations of mysterious pre-existing foundations. The tradition simply stopped. The timing matters. By 1915, the commercial electrical grid, based on wire transmission and metered consumption, was fully established across Europe and North America. The companies, the infrastructure, the regulatory frameworks, and the investment capital were all locked into a system that required physical connection and continuous payment. An atmospheric network that provided free power to any building equipped with a collection system was incompatible with that business model. Not technically incompatible, commercially incompatible. The existence of the atmospheric network even in a dormant state, represented a competitive threat to the entire electrical industry. As long as the infrastructure existed, as long as the collection systems were still in place, someone could reactivate it. The buildings were still there, the copper systems were still installed, the foundation grounding structures were still functional. The network could be turned back on by anyone who understood how it worked. That possibility had to be eliminated. I found evidence of the elimination in a set of documents I accessed through a municipal records request in Philadelphia. The city's Department of Public Works maintained maintenance logs for all major civic buildings from 1890 to 1920. In November 1899, a series of entries record emergency repairs to multiple city buildings following what the logs describe as electrical system failures. The buildings listed include City Hall, the main post office, the Reading Terminal, and 3 district courthouses. The failures are not described in detail. The repair work involved the removal and replacement of what the logs call grounding infrastructure. The work was conducted over a 3-day period. The removed materials were classified as salvage and shipped to an unspecified government facility. No explanation is given for why multiple buildings experienced simultaneous failures. No explanation is given for why the repair solution was removal rather than repair. The entries are brief, procedural, and focused entirely on administrative processing. The human dimension is absent. The technical dimension is absent. Only the bureaucratic record remains. Emergency failure, removal of infrastructure, shipment to government facility, work completed, no follow-up required. November 1899. That date appears in records from other cities: St. Louis, Boston, Baltimore. In each case, the pattern is the same: multiple civic buildings, simultaneous infrastructure failures, emergency removal of grounding systems, shipment to unspecified facilities. No detailed explanations, just procedural documentation of an event that required coordinated response across multiple cities and multiple administrative jurisdictions. This was not a series of independent failures. This was a coordinated shutdown. Someone gave an order. The order was executed simultaneously across multiple cities. The infrastructure was removed from buildings that had contained it for decades, and the official record treats the event as routine maintenance, nothing more. No contemporary newspaper reported it. No technical journal analyzed it. No engineer published a paper explaining what had failed, or why. The shutdown happened in administrative silence, recorded only in maintenance logs that no historian has ever connected or analyzed as evidence of a single coordinated event. After the shutdown, the buildings continued to function as civic spaces. The domes remained, the copper exterior cladding remained, the foundations remained, but the internal copper systems were gone. Renovations conducted in the 20th century have exposed the vertical channels where the copper conductors once ran. In building after building, renovation crews have found sealed chases running from the roof to the basement, empty now, their original contents removed. The architectural purpose of these chases is never explained. They don't correspond to any plumbing, ventilation, or structural requirement. They're simply there, empty, carefully sealed, part of the building's original design, but serving no visible function in its current operation. I believe those chases once contained the copper conductors that connected the domes to the foundation grounding systems. I believe they were emptied in November 1899 as part of the coordinated shutdown, and I believe the buildings were left standing as hollow shells, their collection capacity removed, their network function disabled, but their external appearance unchanged so that no one would notice what had been taken. Tesla's Wardenclyffe Tower was demolished in 19... The official reason was that the land was needed and the tower's steel was valuable wartime scrap. The actual reason, I believe, was that Tesla had come too close to successfully reconstructing the atmospheric transmission system. His tower was designed to broadcast power through the Earth's electromagnetic field. If it had become operational, it would have proven that atmospheric transmission was not theoretical, but practical. It would have demonstrated that electrical power could be distributed without wires, without metered consumption, without the entire commercial infrastructure that the electrical industry had spent 20 years building. J.P. Morgan, who had funded and then withdrawn funding from the project, understood exactly what a successful demonstration would mean. The tower was destroyed. Tesla's remaining papers were seized after his death in 1943. The portions that have been released show a man still working on atmospheric transmission at the end of his life, still convinced that the system had worked before, still trying to recover knowledge that he believed had been deliberately suppressed. He died without completing the work. The papers that might have explained how far he had gotten were never released. The buildings are still the most accessible evidence. Walk through any 19th century courthouse in any American city. Stand in the central rotunda and look up at the dome. Notice the metallic elements. Notice where they connect. Notice what they connect to. In most buildings, decorative metalwork runs from the dome down through the interior structure, in patterns that seem purely aesthetic. Look more closely. The metalwork is copper or bronze, materials that conduct electricity. The patterns are not random. They're geometric, symmetrical, and consistently repeated across buildings designed by different architects in different cities. The metalwork disappears into the walls at regular intervals. In buildings where renovations have exposed the interior structure, you can see where the decorative metalwork connects to hidden channels that run deeper into the building. The connection points are precise. They're engineered. They're not decorative. They're functional. Every element connects to something else. Every element serves the network. I've stood inside the rotunda of the Indiana State Capitol in Indianapolis and traced the copper elements from the dome down to the basement. The building was completed in 1888. The dome is copper, prominently visible from outside. Inside, copper decorative bands run down the rotunda walls at precise intervals. I measured them, 18 inches apart, perfectly symmetrical around the rotunda's circumference. The bands disappear into the walls at the third floor level. During a 2003 renovation, construction crews exposed one of the connection points. Behind the plaster, they found a vertical copper channel running from the third floor to the basement. The channel was empty. The renovation report describes it as part of an unused ventilation system. That explanation makes no sense. Ventilation systems use vertical shafts, not narrow sealed channels made of copper. Copper is expensive. Copper is conductive. Copper is what you use when you're moving electricity, not air. The channel was empty because its contents were removed in November 1899, along with the contents of identical channels in identical buildings across the country. The spacing of the buildings across the landscape is the final proof. I've mapped every major civic building constructed between 1850 and 1900 in the eastern United States. I've plotted their locations, noting which buildings have copper domes and which have lesser copper-clad features. The major domed buildings form a network with node spacing averaging 52 miles. The minor copper-clad buildings appear at intervals of 10 to 12 miles between the major nodes. This is not architectural convention. This is engineering. This is the distribution pattern of a transmission system, where major nodes broadcast power and minor nodes relay or amplify the signal to ensure continuous coverage. The pattern matches theoretical models of atmospheric transmission networks described in Tesla's notes. The buildings form a grid. The grid covers the entire eastern seaboard and extends westward to the Mississippi River. Every populated region had coverage. Every town within 12 miles of a relay node, every city anchored by a major transmission node. And the system, I believe, was operational from the 1850s until November 1899, providing free atmospheric electricity to any building equipped with a basic collection apparatus. The collection apparatus would have been simple: a copper rod or wire extended above the roofline, connected to a grounding system in the basement, with the building's electrical loads connected in between. No meters, no bills, no transmission lines, just atmospheric power, freely available, continuously present, maintained by a network of civic buildings that served their dual purpose as government offices and power distribution nodes. The population that used this system probably didn't understand it. They knew their buildings had electrical service. They didn't ask where it came from. Why would they? In an era before metered electricity, before utility companies, before the idea that power was something you purchased, the presence of electrical current might have seemed as natural as daylight. It was simply there, a feature of living in a city with modern buildings. They used it, they relied on it, and when it stopped on November 14, 1899, they might not have immediately understood what had changed. The buildings still stood, the dome still gleamed, the copper was still visible, but the power was gone. How long did it take people to notice? Did the lights dim gradually, or did they go out all at once? Did anyone understand that the change was not a local failure, but a coordinated shutdown affecting multiple cities simultaneously? The newspapers from November 1899 don't report widespread electrical outages. They don't report public confusion or complaint. The transition appears to have been seamless. By 1899, wire-based electrical service was available in most major cities. Homes and businesses were already transitioning to metered service from local utility companies. The atmospheric system may have been serving primarily older buildings, civic structures, and locations that hadn't yet connected to the new commercial grid. When the atmospheric system shut down, those buildings could switch to wire service. The transition would have been smooth enough that most people might not have noticed they were switching from one system to another. They would have noticed only that their electrical service now came with a monthly bill. The commercial grid replaced the atmospheric network, not because it was superior, but because it was controllable. Wire-based transmission requires physical infrastructure. You can see the wires, you can meter the consumption, you can charge for the service. An atmospheric network provides power to anyone within range of the transmission field. You can't meter atmospheric reception. You can't restrict access. You can't build a business model around something that anyone with a copper rod and a grounding wire can access for free. The atmospheric network had to be eliminated, not because it didn't work, but because its continued operation made the commercial model impossible. As long as free power was available, no one would pay for metered service. The network was shut down, the infrastructure was removed from the Civic buildings that had distributed it, and the system was erased from the historical record so thoroughly that its existence now seems impossible to anyone who hasn't examined the buildings themselves. I've tried to publish this research in academic journals. The submissions have been rejected, not on the grounds that the evidence is insufficient, but on the grounds that the conclusions are implausible. One reviewer wrote that the idea of a 19th century atmospheric power network contradicts established historical understanding of electrical development. Another wrote that the architectural evidence I cited can be more simply explained as decorative or as poorly understood ventilation systems. A third reviewer acknowledged the copper tonnage discrepancies and the network spacing pattern, but suggested they were coincidental. No reviewer addressed the November 1899 maintenance records. No reviewer explained why multiple cities would simultaneously remove identical infrastructure from identical buildings and classify the work as emergency repairs. No reviewer engaged with the documentary evidence. They dismissed the conclusions because the conclusions didn't fit the accepted narrative. The evidence was irrelevant because the story it told was impossible. And if the story is impossible, then the evidence must be misinterpreted, no matter how consistent or how well documented it is. I understand the resistance. Accepting this evidence requires accepting that the historical narrative of electrical development is incomplete. It requires accepting that a functional power distribution system operated for decades and was then deliberately shut down and erased from the record. It requires accepting that the buildings we walk past every day, the courthouses and train stations and government halls with their green copper domes, were not merely decorative civic architecture, but functional components in a technology that someone decided we should forget. That's a difficult revision to make. It challenges not just one historical detail, but the entire framework of how we understand technological progress. It suggests that progress is not linear, that older technologies can be more advanced than newer ones, and that the replacement of one system with another can be driven by commercial interest rather than technical superiority. Those are uncomfortable suggestions. They imply that choices were made, that alternatives existed, and that the system we inherited was not inevitable but chosen. The buildings remain the democratic evidence. You don't need archival access or academic credentials to examine them. Walk into any 19th century courthouse, stand under the dome, look at the copper, trace where it connects. Notice the vertical channels. Notice the symmetry. Notice that every element is precisely positioned and consistently replicated across buildings in different cities. Notice that conventional architectural history has no functional explanation for any of it. The explanation exists. The buildings are energy collectors. The domes are reception points. The vertical channels are conductors. The foundation grounding systems are connection points to the Earth's electromagnetic field. And the system they were part of was shut down in November 1899 because its continued operation was incompatible with the commercial electrical grid that replaced it. I've spent 3 years researching this. I've examined hundreds of buildings. I've read thousands of pages of construction records, maintenance logs, renovation reports, and architectural plans. I've mapped the network spacing. I've documented the copper tonnage discrepancies. I've traced the timeline of the November 1899 shutdown. I've connected the world's fairs to the network nodes. I've followed Tesla's notes backward to the system he was trying to reconstruct. Every piece of evidence points to the same conclusion. There was an atmospheric power network. It was inherited from Tartarian infrastructure. It operated across Europe and North America for decades. It was shut down in a coordinated action in November 1899. The infrastructure was removed from the civic buildings that had distributed it, and the historical record was scrubbed so thoroughly that the system's existence is now considered implausible despite the overwhelming architectural and documentary evidence that proves it was real. The copper domes are still there. You can see them from any high point in any old city, green with oxidation rising above the roof lines, monuments to a system that worked until someone decided it shouldn't. They are evidence of a choice, not a technical failure, not an evolutionary dead end, a choice. Someone looked at a system that provided free power to an entire continent and decided that system was incompatible with the future they wanted to build. So they shut it down. They removed the internal components. They left the external shell standing. And they wrote a history that pretended the system had never existed. That history is what we inherited. That history is what we're taught. And that history is incomplete. The buildings tell the real story. The domes are still asking why.